On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 26, Justice Served. The courtroom was packed. Dusty could feel the weight of every person in the room, the quiet hum of anticipation, the occasional rustle of papers, the heavy silence that hung like a cloud. Sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, shadowed lines on the polished wood floors. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a sterile reminder of the law's cold impartiality. Dusty sat in the back of the courtroom, his hands resting on his knees, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. Jackson Brown, the man who had haunted his every step, was finally facing justice. But as Dusty sat there, watching Jackson at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer, he couldn't help but feel the hollow ache in his chest. Victory didn't taste as sweet as he thought it would. The battle had taken its toll, on him, on the people he cared about, and on the city. Next to him, Roxy sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her lips moving in silent prayer. Megan was beside her, her face set in a mask of quiet determination. Ethan sat on the other side of Dusty, his presence a steadying force, though his eyes held a sadness that Dusty hadn't noticed before. Lucy and Maria were there too, all of them gathered together in the back row, whispering prayers of thanks to God. The courtroom had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where they could finally breathe, finally let go of the fear and pain that had followed them for so long. At the front of the room, Jackson sat, his hands cuffed to the table, his face an unreadable mask. Dusty had expected to feel satisfaction seeing him like this, broken, defeated, powerless. But instead, there was only a quiet emptiness in his chest, as if the victory had come at too great a cost. The judge's voice, deep and authoritative, cut through the silence. Mr. Brown, you stand accused of multiple counts of human trafficking, drug distribution, and conspiracy to commit murder, among other charges. The prosecution has presented overwhelming evidence of your involvement in these heinous crimes. Jackson's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Jackson remained still, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, far beyond the walls of the courtroom. He didn't seem to care. He didn't seem to care about anything. Dusty's jaw clenched, a wave of anger surging through him. How could Jackson be so detached, so cold, after everything he had done? After the lives he had destroyed? The judge continued, his voice steady and unwavering. Before we move to sentencing, the court will hear testimony from one final witness. Pastor Ethan Embry, please take the stand. Dusty's heart skipped a beat, his eyes darting toward Ethan, who sat beside him with his hands folded in his lap. Ethan didn't move at first, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. His normally calm expression was tight with tension, his eyes distant, as though he were bracing himself for something he had long tried to avoid. Ethan stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step took an enormous amount of effort. Dusty watched him, his heart aching for the older man. He had always known there was more to Ethan's past than he had shared, but he never expected it to come to light like this. Ethan walked to the witness stand, his shoulders squared, but Dusty could see the tremor in his hands as he took the oath. His face, usually so composed and serene, looked weathered, worn by years of grief and loss that had finally surfaced. Once seated, Ethan glanced at the judge, then at the jury, his eyes lingering for a moment on Jackson, who hadn't even bothered to look up. Dusty held his breath, sensing that something deeply personal, something painful, was about to be revealed. Pastor Embry, the prosecutor began, could you please tell the court how you came to know Jackson Brown? Ethan's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, as though each word was dragged up from the depths of his soul. I didn't know Jackson Brown by that name at first. He came into my life through my son, Mike. Dusty's heart clenched, and he saw Megan stiffen beside him, her hand instinctively moving to cover her mouth. Ethan had never mentioned a son. Ethan continued, his gaze focused on the wood grain of the witness stand. Mike was a good boy. He was kind, smart, had a heart for people, but he got lost somewhere along the way, fell in with the wrong crowd. And Jackson, his voice faltered for a moment before he pushed forward. Jackson was there to take advantage of that. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on everyone present. Jackson got Mike hooked on drugs, Ethan said, his voice trembling with barely restrained emotion. Fentanyl, just like he did with so many others. It was how he kept control, how he made sure people stayed in line. My son became one of his victims, just like the girls, just like all the people he trafficked. A tear slipped down Ethan's cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. His hands clenched tightly around the edges of the stand. Mike overdosed 2 years ago. I found him in his apartment, dead. Gasps echoed through the room, but Dusty barely heard them. His heart was hammering in his chest, his throat tight with emotion as he watched Ethan, who was struggling to keep his composure. I tried to save him, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. I tried to pull him out of that life, but I couldn't. I couldn't save him. Jackson had him, and I lost him. For the first time since Dusty had known him, Ethan looked completely shattered. His calm, stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by raw grief and pain that had been buried for too long. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the sorrow, all the heartache Ethan had carried inside was pouring out for the world to see. I am here today, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, because I want justice. Not just for Mike, but for all the others, for the children, the women, the men who were stolen from their lives by this man. I want him to pay for what he's done. Dusty's eyes stung with unshed tears as Ethan stepped down from the witness stand, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief. As he made his way back to the pew, Dusty reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's arm in silent solidarity. Ethan didn't look up, but Dusty felt the faint tremor in the older man's body, the unspoken gratitude for the small gesture. The judge cleared his throat, his voice filled with gravitas as he addressed the jury. You have heard the testimonies, and you have seen the evidence. The time has come for you to deliberate and deliver a verdict. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest, his mind swirling with emotions. Relief, anger, sorrow. He had fought so hard for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt different than he had imagined. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson, a woman in her mid-30s, stood and faced the judge. Have you reached a verdict? The judge asked, his voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, the woman replied, her voice clear and strong. We find the defendant, Jackson Brown, guilty on all counts. Dusty let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands gripping the edge of the pew as a wave of relief washed over him. Roxy whispered a soft prayer beside him, her voice trembling with emotion. Megan closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent thanks, while Maria's hand rested over her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly together, his body shaking with quiet sobs. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, firm and resolute. Jackson Brown, you have been found guilty of human trafficking, drug distribution, conspiracy to commit murder, and numerous other charges. I hereby sentence you to 10 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security penitentiary, without the possibility of parole. There was a collective exhale from the courtroom as the final sentence was handed down. Justice, at long last, had been served. Jackson didn't react. He sat there, his face blank, his eyes empty, as though the weight of his fate hadn't even registered. The bailiff moved to take him away, but Jackson didn't resist. He simply stood, his body limp, as he was led out of the courtroom. In the back row, Dusty closed his eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks to the God who had carried him through this long, brutal fight. Beside him, Roxy, Megan, Lucy, Maria, and Ethan whispered their own prayers, their voices blending together in a quiet chorus of gratitude. It was over.